Torchlight flickers against stone walls. A monk leans over ancient parchment, translating forgotten Greek texts by hand. Outside, a woman in armor trains for battle, while townsfolk gather for a traveling physician who swears by surgeries passed down since Roman times. No, this isn't fantasy. This was the Middle Ages. We've been taught to call them the Dark Ages, a label clumsily slapped on by Renaissance thinkers and Victorian romantics who believed nothing but ignorance reigned for 1,000 years after Rome fell. But dig deeper, and you'll find a world more nuanced and alive than most people imagine. It was brutal at times, yes, but also astonishingly inventive, curious, interconnected, and human. Now let's descend the ladder of time, fact by fact, through 10 surprising truths that defy everything you thought you knew about the Middle Ages. 10. People in the Middle Ages were obsessed with cleanliness. Forget the idea of foul-smelling peasants and unwashed nobles. Personal hygiene was taken quite seriously in medieval Europe, far more than most pop culture likes to admit. Public bathhouses were common across cities like Paris, London, and Cologne. In fact, in cities like Prague, records show bathhouse attendance was as frequent as church-going. Most people washed regularly with water and natural soaps. Nobles had private bathing tubs. Even peasants would use wooden barrels or wash basins. Monasteries had strict hygiene rules. Monks washed their hands before meals, shaved regularly, and even brushed their teeth with herbal concoctions. Bathing wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. That said, attitudes shifted after the Black Death in the 14th century. People grew suspicious of hot water and open pores, wrongly believing they allowed disease to enter the body. Public baths began closing, not from lack of cleanliness, but from fear. Still, it's hard to maintain the filthy medieval myth once you learn medieval London had over a dozen public bathhouses, and fines were levied for throwing waste into the streets instead of the designated cesspits. 9. Some medieval women were surgeons, landowners, and warriors. The notion that women were completely sidelined during the Middle Ages doesn't hold up under close inspection. Yes, patriarchy was dominant, and legal rights were often restricted. But within these limits, many women found ways to wield surprising power. Take Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, who wasn't just a religious leader. She was a composer, scientist, physician, and philosopher. Her medical texts on women's health were groundbreaking for the time. In medicine, women known as wise women or alewives often acted as healers and midwives. Some were even officially licensed surgeons, such as Jacoba Felicier, a 14th century physician in Paris who had a client list filled with aristocrats. And yes, women fought. Joan of Arc is the most famous, but not the only one. In Spain, Lady Maria de Molina held armies together. In Scandinavia, shield maidens appeared in Norse sagas, and archaeological finds back their existence. Even in England, noble women like Nicola de la Haye defended castles during sieges. It wasn't an age of total female oppression. It was more like a chessboard, restricted, but with queens capable of bold and brilliant moves. 8. The Middle Ages were more global than you think. When people picture the Middle Ages, they often imagine a closed-off, grimy Europe, trapped in a bubble of war, plagues, and local feuds. But medieval societies were astonishingly connected, and their networks spanned continents. Trade routes from the Far East fed European markets with silks, spices, glass, and perfumes. Arabic and Persian scholars preserved and advanced knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine, which later passed to Europe via Spain and Sicily. Even in the 9th century, Viking coins from Baghdad have been found buried in Scandinavian soil. One of the most surprising global connections? The African Empire of Mali, ruled by Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 stunned the Islamic world with his legendary wealth. His journey left trails of gold so rich, it reportedly devalued currency in Cairo for a decade. Meanwhile, Chinese inventions like gunpowder, paper, and the compass quietly filtered into Europe through trade and conquest. Knowledge didn't stop flowing, it just changed hands. 7. Universities, eyeglasses, and mechanical clocks were medieval inventions. It's tempting to credit modern life to the Renaissance, but many of the building blocks came straight out of the Middle Ages. Take universities. The oldest university still operating today, the University of Bologna, was founded in 1088. Oxford, around 1096. Paris, 1150. These institutions became vibrant intellectual hubs, producing law, theology, and medical graduates who reshaped European thought. Then there's the humble eyeglass, invented in Italy in the late 13th century. These weren't rare curiosities. They were mass-produced by the 15th century and widely used by scholars and scribes. And perhaps the most quietly revolutionary device, the mechanical clock. By the 14th century, towns like Milan and Strasbourg were installing public clocks powered by gears and weights, changing how people understood time itself. It was no longer tethered to sunlight or seasons. It ticked, minute by minute, forward. For a so-called dark age, it was full of spark. 6. Not all castles were cold and crumbling. Popular imagination paints medieval castles as damp, drafty, and eternally gray. In truth, many castles, especially those owned by nobility, were colorful, lavishly decorated, and surprisingly cozy by period standards. Walls were often whitewashed or painted in bright colors. Tapestries hung to insulate rooms and display wealth. Fireplaces, feather mattresses, glazed windows, and even plumbing systems existed in some elite households. Château de Coucy in France had a donjon, main tower, with an internal diameter of over 30 meters, complete with fireplaces and latrines on every floor. Medieval lords didn't just build for war, they built for comfort and status. It was part home, part fortress, and part political statement. Sure, life inside wasn't quite a palace, and you'd still hear the howls of the wind some nights. But cold and crumbling? That's a Renaissance illusion, not reality. 5. Peasants had more freedom than you might think. Life was hard for peasants, no question. Backbreaking work, high taxes, and vulnerability to crop failure made it a precarious existence. But they weren't all powerless or landless serfs chained to their lord's will. In fact, many peasants owned their own plots, negotiated rent, or worked part-time on a lord's land. In England, by the 13th century, the number of fully bonded serfs had drastically declined, replaced by tenants who paid in cash or crops. Peasant communities also had their own courts, festivals, and customs. They brewed beer, held local fairs, played games, sang songs, and sometimes even went on strike. In 1381, the Peasants' Revolt in England saw thousands march to London to demand reforms. 4. The medieval church was a hotbed of science and knowledge. It might seem contradictory to imagine monks studying astronomy or copying pagan texts, but monasteries and cathedral schools were among the greatest engines of learning during the Middle Ages. Rather than being anti-science, the medieval church often preserved and transmitted scientific knowledge. Monasteries housed some of the largest libraries in Europe, filled with volumes in Greek, Latin, and Arabic. Monks and scholars copied and annotated classical texts, many of which would have been lost forever if not for their meticulous effort. Figures like Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, conducted experiments in optics, mechanics, and alchemy. He emphasized observation and inquiry, concepts that later shaped the scientific method. Even theology intersected with natural science. Scholars believed understanding the physical world brought them closer to understanding God's design. So, they studied the stars, plants, human anatomy, and weather patterns, not in spite of their faith, but because of it. The notion of an anti-science church is a myth of later centuries. The truth is far more layered and often more fascinating. 3. Medicine was surprisingly advanced and occasionally gruesome. It's easy to imagine medieval medicine as a horror show of bloodletting and superstition. And yes, some of that existed, but dig beneath the surface and you'll find surprising sophistication. Medieval doctors diagnosed illnesses using the four humors theory, borrowed from ancient Greece. But they also performed complex surgeries, set broken bones, and cleaned wounds with wine and herbal antiseptics. Islamic texts like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine were standard reading in European medical schools. Hospitals were common in larger cities, often attached to monasteries or churches. These weren't just places to die. They provided care, beds, food, and rudimentary treatments. Leper hospitals, plague houses, and mental health wards existed in some areas centuries before modern equivalents. Yes, trepanning, drilling holes into the skull, was a thing. Yes, some remedies involved toad powder or powdered mummy, grim. But others involved antiseptic balms, dietary regulations, and even quarantine protocols. The image of medieval physicians as clueless butchers misses a key truth. For their time, they were doing the best they could, often with a method that surprises modern historians. 2. Education was far more widespread than we assume. The idea that everyone outside the clergy was illiterate is more myth than fact. While it's true that literacy rates were lower than today, they were not negligible, especially after the 12th century. Cathedral schools and grammar schools taught Latin, logic, arithmetic, and rhetoric. Guilds taught apprentices how to read trade documents. Even some peasants could read basic religious texts or legal documents relating to their land. Women, too, had access to education, especially among the nobility. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine were well-read and influential. Girls in convents studied Latin, theology, and philosophy. One of the most powerful intellectual voices of the time was Christine de Pizan, a female writer who fiercely defended women's intellectual capacities. And as parchment and ink became more accessible, books, often copied by hand, began to circulate more widely. Some towns even had book rental services, the precursors of libraries. By the time Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 15th century, literacy was already spreading fast, and the Middle Ages had laid the groundwork. 1. The Middle Ages were wildly creative, weird, and wonderfully human. If you only judge the Middle Ages by plague and war, you'll miss their beating heart, their art, their imagination, and their sense of humor. This was the age of gargoyles and illuminated manuscripts, of bizarre marginalia, where rabbits fought knights and snails jousted with monks. Mystery plays acted out biblical scenes in the town square, often with dark comedy and surprising irreverence. Cathedrals soared upward with pointed arches and stained glass, so vivid it could tell a whole story without a single word. Poets wrote tales of doomed lovers, wandering knights, and dragons hidden in the mist. They were obsessed with time, the cosmos, the soul, the seasons. They laughed, grieved, and danced, sometimes all in the same day. Was it violent? Absolutely. But it was also vibrant. The Middle Ages weren't a bridge between two greater ages. They were an age of their own, alive with contradiction, bursting with spirit. We often think of history in tidy labels. The Middle Ages, dark. The Renaissance, enlightened. But history, real history, is messy. The Middle Ages had brutality, yes, but also brilliance. It had suppression, but also resilience, plague and poetry, war and wonder. To paint it as an era of ignorance is to silence the monks who studied the stars, the women who led armies, the peasants who protested, and the thinkers who dreamed of machines that could measure time. We have come to the end of this video. Please don't forget to give this video a like, share with someone, comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more videos.